I'm happy to greet everyone who is listening to us today. We're about to start our roundtable discussion, and the topic of today's discussion is the contexts of Ukrainian futurism. It's happening as the part of the project Futuromarennia, the futuristic deliriums, and it is taking place here in Kiev in Mistecький arsenal venue. It's starting from tomorrow, 15th of October, and will last until 29th of January of 2022. My name is Igor Oksametny, and I will be the moderator of today's roundtable. And as a co-supervisor of this project, together with my colleague Viktoria Velichko, I would like to say a couple of words about this project. The project Futuristic Delirium is an attempt to visualize this complex, this controversial but yet so interesting phenomena of Ukrainian futurism. During these projects, we are trying and doing our best to discover the impacts of Ukrainian futurism and to go deeper in its aspects. And we try to discover how different aspects of Ukrainian culture were influenced by Ukrainian futurism in the beginning of the 20th century. Performing arts, visual arts, cinema, theater, literature, architecture, those are all the spheres that we are discovering, and the museums of Ukraine have kindly supplied us with different exhibits, and today we have more than 500 of those in our collection. We also contacted archives, libraries, and private collectors to enrich our exhibition. We are hoping that people who will come to Mistecький arsenal and who will discover these phenomenon for the first time will feel the atmosphere of that period and will indulge the energy of artists of that time. We hope that through space and time they will be able to spiritually meet poets, artists, and directors of that time. We also hope that this exhibition will be as interesting to the people who are experts on the topic and who are collecting the valuable artistic works from that epoch. That's why we have tried our best to collect the rare, valuable, and collectible items that haven't been exposed before. Also, I wanted to state and mention that this project is being sponsored by Ukrainian Cultural Fund. Also, as I have already mentioned, this topic is so complicated and so controversial that we thought it wouldn't have been right to discuss it without the presence of experts on this topic. So we have divided our roundtable discussion into 2 days, today and tomorrow. That's why we also have invited people on whose scientific, journalistic, and literature work and articles on which we have based our research with Viktoria Velichko. So, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our today's speakers. First will be Oleh Ilnytskyi. Mr. Ilnytskyi is a professor at Alberta University and also is the author of the book Ukrainian Futurism from 1914 till 1930s. I'm happy to warmly welcome you to our discussion today. Our next participant is Dr. Przemysław Strączek. He is a representative of Artistic Institute of Polish Academy of Sciences of Warsaw. Happy to welcome you. Our next guest speaker is Andriy Boyarov. He is a media artist, architect, supervisor, and explorer of Ukrainian and in particularly Lviv avant-garde. I am speaking currently from the old part of the Mistecький arsenal building, which is a place where we usually hold such events. And our speakers are joining us from Warsaw, Lviv, and Canada. We will start with Professor Ilnytskyi, since you are, with no doubt, a pioneer of this topic. You started discovering Ukrainian futurism as early as 1977. It was first your dissertation, and then it was published as a book in English, and it came out in Ukrainian in 2003. Nowadays, a lot of people quote this book, they rely on the source of this book, so for me it makes perfect sense that you will be the one to start our meeting. Maybe during this time your point of view on some of the aspects of the topic have changed, and we will be delighted to hear about it. We are interested how Oleh Ilnytskyi is perceiving the topic of Ukrainian futurism today. I'm sorry, Mr. Ilnytskyi, it seems like your microphone is not working. Can you unmute it, please? Can you hear me now? Well, I am delighted to be here among you today, and thank you very much for inviting me in such an interesting roundtable. I'm contacting you today from Calgary town in Canada. It's 8 a.m. here and the sun is about to rise. I'm sincerely honored to take part in the project Futuristic Delirium. I like the name so much and I believe that Cemencore will be delighted to hear it. And I want to thank the supervisors Igor and Victoria for inviting me here today. I believe that my part today is here rather modest. I will try to tell in a few words what I believe Ukrainian Futurism is based on my own publishings. So, in my opinion, the project Futuristic Delirium in Ukraine right now shows us that the notion of Ukrainian futurism is being acknowledged by more and more people. So we should be happy about it. But as we know, during the Soviet terror, during decades, it has been declined its right to exist. It has been considered as a threat to a culture. Even before the Soviet government, Ukrainian intellectuals considered Ukrainian futurism not natural, not organic, but rather a plagiarism of Italian and Russian futurisms. They even considered it idiotic and they thought it stands in the way of the development of Ukrainian culture. So it's completely understandable why one of the founders of Ukrainian Futurism, Mikhailo Cemencore, in 1922 complained about it in one of his poems, and the poem goes like this. It's easier for 3 camels and a cow to go through the ear of the needle than for the Ukrainian futurist to get to his own people. I personally started discovering this phenomenon when I was a postgraduate in Harvard University in 1977, and what particularly interested me why this phenomenon was so frowned upon in Ukrainian culture. My first publishing on this topic came out in 1978, and in March of 1989 I came to Ukraine. Before that I wasn't able to do so. So I came as a participant of the Kiev International Conference. There I have read my paper Shevchenko and Futurists. I remember that it has surprised and even astonished some of the critics that time. My book, as you have already mentioned, came out in English in 1997 and in Ukrainian in 2003. So let's recall together that first Futurists were Italians and they first came out to the world in 1909. They did so by publishing a manifest in French in Parisian newspaper Il Figaro, publishing it beforehand in Italian. Their leader, Filippo Marinetti, was a first-class cultural promoter, entrepreneur, and in general a rich man. A bit later, the fascist movement put a dark, long shadow on all the artistic achievements of futurists. He came to the Russian Empire in 1914 January in a very noticeable manner. He came there to promote himself and his movement. Interesting fact that a month later, in February, in Kiev, Mikhail Cemencore publishes his first futuristic work called Daring. This was his first step in introducing a new branch of Ukrainian futurism, queer futurism. There is no doubt that Cemencore was under the influence of Italian and Russian futurists. But let's not exaggerate that fact, since very often it is done to undermine the original importance of Ukrainian futurism movement. Cemencore, out of principle, was moving westward with his works and consciously wanted to be a part of international avant-garde. Unlike some Ukrainians, for example, David Burylyuk, he didn't take part in Russian-speaking events of Russian Empire. And I consciously don't call these events Russian culture. Cemencore was striving to create national Ukrainian avant-garde. His goal was psychologically and artistically implement new ideas of the world culture in Ukraine of that time. It was a painful process for himself in the first place because it was so hard to fight the old-fashioned way of thinking. And of course it was painful for the Ukrainian general public as well. Cemencore ended all his contacts with his colleagues of futurists and symbolists, and he started to change the whole model of Ukrainian literature. Especially he wanted to fight the dominant cult of beauty and aesthetics in the literature. The bright representative of that beauty cult domination aspect was Mykola Voronei, and in one of his poems he stated, "I love beauty, and with each minute I create an illusion, and this illusion I love and glorify. I love beauty as much as I love Ukraine itself." And Cemencore replaces that lyrical, poetic, and sometimes too melodramatic tone with a futuristic tone, which is sometimes a bit rough and ironic. In the places where before was the lyrical description of nature comes the rough description of urbanistic landscape. For example, in his poems when he describes Kiev, the first thing he states is how acacia stinks in spring. There is no place in Cemencore's heart for anything subtle. Gentleness of Cemencore throws you under the bus. He doesn't want glory among his own kind just for the bag of garbage. He states, "I don't really care about Kiev and my relatives when really the inhabitants of planet Mars should know about Cemencore." This is very sincere work of his that was published in 1914. As we see, Cemencore officially demonstrates his alienation from his modern Ukrainian culture. Ironically, though, his all artistic works are dedicated to it. He was shot in 1937 for being claimed as a Ukrainian nationalist. After the revolution, Cemencore positions himself as a poet and literature movement representative. He also positions himself as a person of a left political views, but not a communist. He looks at the leaders of communistic party with skepticisms. He doesn't consider them as leaders, not in the cultural branch anyway. Since, according to Cemencore, Marxism couldn't cope with the ideas of literature, he introduces his idea of pan-futurism. He sees it as a way out of the cultural deadlock. He consciously denies the attempts to restore old-fashioned realism as a method to recreate a new form of society. Pan-futurism was various and multidimensional theory. Pan-futurism is the theory that Cemencore and his colleagues Slюсаренко, Poltoratsky, Ilnytskyi was working on during the 1920s. But as a base of this theory was the notion of pan-avant-garde. In other words, pan-futurism of that time had no other choice but to take on from European and Soviet avant-garde movements. Also, we can say that futurists did both destructive and constructive decisions. They destroyed the whole notion and vision of the old artistic ways and discovered and opened and introduced new ones. We also need to remind ourselves that in the first half of 1920s there were literature organizations such as Plugh, and futurists tried to intervene and be in collaboration with village inhabitants and workers. For instance, they tried to bypass the general stereotype that futurists is the group of elite and intellectual people who don't really care about the destiny of the general public. So there was a short period of time in the history of futurism when these organizations started to spread their avant-garde ideas among the general public and started to invite as much as possible people to their organizations. Due to the number of complicated external and internal reasons, Futurism as an organized movement ceased to exist in 1925. During the next 2 years, Cemencore and his two friends Mykola Bazhan and Yuri Yanovsky project their artistic minds towards the art of cinema. At that time, the most young and the most revolutionary-oriented art form, as they thought at that time. They are also friends with Alexander Dovzhenko. Cemencore becomes a head of scriptwriters department in all Ukrainian photo cinema administration in Odessa. In general, the contribution of futurists and those who were around them was very significant for Ukrainian cinema, especially as we take a look on the critics of the 1920s. Here we can mention Leonid Skripnik and his sequence of publishings about photo and cinema, or for example Alexei Poltoratsky, who published his book Etudes on Theory of Cinema in 1930s. Also in this row are Dmitro Busko, Mikhailo Bazhan, Saslo Patinsky, Geush Krupi. They all unraveled different aspects of cinema in their works. And sometimes they directly took part in the movie-making process as scriptwriters. In 1927, the political situation changes. At that time, Mykola Skripnik becomes the head of Education Ministry, and he supports the free competitiveness of different art forms. Cemencore at that time manages to reinvent his avant-garde movement. He launches and publishes his magazine New Generation. It was without any doubt a high peak of Ukrainian Futurists at that time. The magazine existed without any breaks for 3 years, and it encountered as many as 80 collaborators, but in fact the real authors were certainly shorter amount. Among those authors were truly futurists, but also authors who were seeking a place to publish their literature experiments. The magazine covered the whole spectrum of avant-garde branches, starting from paintings, theater, cinema, architecture, and of course, obviously, literature. The New Generation informed regularly about the artistic events in Europe. It had its headlines and sub-headlines in English, French, German, and even Esperanto. From the moment Ukrainian Futurism appeared in 1914, it went hand in hand with artists, and in aspect of publishing books, they strived not just to surprise the reader with the text, but also to astonish him with the visual aspect of the books. During the first stage of that process, Vasyl Cemencore, the brother of Mikhailo Cemencore, and Pavlo Kovzhun were helping in that particular aspect. Next personalities of this epoch were Nina Henken-Meller and her husband Vadim Meller, who was particularly responsible for the design of the first publishings of the New Generation magazine. Later on that job, Anatoly Petritsky came to substitute Vadim Meller, and also the photographer Dan Sotnik came as well. The New Generation magazine till this day remains one of the most remarkable examples of bold combination of content and visual arrangements. Futuristic movement recognizes Italian movement as a breaking point in the history of arts. Ukrainian Futurists openly connected the origin of their formal activity with Italian movement, steadily sticking to the name and definition of Futurism. At the same time, Ukrainian Futuristic movement decisively separated themselves from political and ideological side of their Italian colleagues. Still, Ukrainian Futurists never considered themselves as a derivative movement. They viewed themselves as a history-oriented group that reacted accordingly not only to a rapidly changing art development process, but additionally to its own very specific social and cultural surroundings, in both of which they were obliged to fight inertia. They defended pan-avant-garde orientation and perceived new changes in Europe and Soviet Union sensitively. Artistic movements as Dada, Expressionism, and Soviet Constructivism made huge impact on Ukrainian futurism, which, although still made some forced references towards socially mandatory topics, always favored destruction as a precondition to truly new phase of art. Thanks a lot for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Ilnytskyi. You were referring to this particular quote about 3 camels. Georgy Kovalenko, famous art historian, wrote about organic addition of futurism to the existing Ukrainian culture. For instance, here is a direct quote of his. Futurism of Ukrainian culture, oddly, seemed very natural. It seems as if Ukrainian culture has been waiting for it and accepted it as something that goes in effortlessly, without saying. It is obvious that in the first case, in 1922, Cemencore is talking about the camels. He is referring to the resistance of his peers and surroundings. I guess the similar process was in every country, and Kovalenko, in his turn, is mentioning the general need of culture in a new wave that he is reflecting on nowadays. Please share your personal opinion on the matter. Do you think futurism was an organic phenomena for Ukrainian culture? Quite an interesting question. The first answer that came to my mind was no. I believe it is an exaggeration. As we know from the texts of that period, that unacceptance of futurism by a general public was very strong. It was perceived as something foreign. Modernism and symbolism, those were the art branches that were organic for Ukraine of that period. Pavlo Tychyna and Alexander Oleh, for example, were positively accepted by their peers, although Cemencore and his supporters not so much. So I believe that futurism was such a new phenomenon that it kind of shocked socially privileged intellectuals of that time. And the Ukrainian intellectual elites that were making art in the context of Ukrainian culture during that period, we should not forget the history of Russian Empire, though, banning of anything Ukrainian, Russian chauvinism at the beginning of 20th century. In this context, such statements of Cemencore, "I'm burning my Kobzar," "Shevchenko is under my feet," those shocked Ukrainian society of that time, maybe even more than Italians could shock their surroundings when they declared that they would burn museums. So I would not say that implementation of Ukrainian futurism was an organic process. However, it is clear that with time and effort futurists put in, a lot has changed. And I think even already starting from the second half of the 20th century, futurism became much more organic. But yet again, it took some effort of young Ukrainian intellectuals, representatives of Avant-Garde, to change people's attitudes towards it in particular and towards the new art forms in general. Thank you, Mr. Ilnytskyi. We are proceeding with our discussion, but I promise we will be back to the topic of Leonid Skripnik. Right now, I want to give the floor to Przemysław Strączek, who is the explorer of Polish and Italian futurism. And also, I wanted to state that we have enough of information sources on the relationships between Ukrainian and Russian, Ukrainian and Italian futurism, but at the same time, we are missing some important pieces of information how these processes were unfolding in neighboring countries such as Poland, Czech Republic, and Austro-Hungarian Empire. And with that particular context, I believe Mr. Strączek will help us out. So without further ado, let's hear about the Futurism movement history in Poland.
Hello. Do you hear me? And do you see the presentation which I am sharing now with you? Igor, yes. Do you see the presentation? Okay, great. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. At the beginning, I just would like to express my gratitude to Igor and Victoria for organizing this wonderful event. Unfortunately, I was not able to come and to visit for the opening the exhibition. but I still hope that until end of January, I will be able to visit it. I also would like to say that I'm very honored to be in the panel with Professor Ilnytskyi, whose book, of course, I know on Ukrainian Futurism, and this book I also see in the on the shelf in the library over there behind. And I am also very happy to be in the same panel with my dear colleague Andriy Boyarov, who, I don't know, I never met a person who loved his city so much as Andriy loves Lviv. So I'm also very happy to form a part of this very panel. And last but not least, before I start to talk about Polish futurism, I will also need to praise the translation. It's like really wonderful. It's amazing, and thank you very much for this amazing translation. So I was asked by Igor to prepare a short presentation around Polish futurism. So since I still do not have much time, I would like to speed up a little bit. So when we talk about Polish futurism was mainly a literary phenomenon. And it was a very short-lived phenomenon, which actually is limited most notably to 5 Polish poets, but not only, but they were the main poets who formed the Polish Futurist group. These were Anatol Stern and Aleksander Wat from Warsaw, Bruno Jasiński, and who is in the middle, and Stanisław Modorzeniec and Tytus Czyżewski. Modorzeniec, Jasiński, and Czyżewski, they were from Kraków. So Warsaw and Kraków were a sort of centers of Polish futurism, I mean, where Polish futurism emerged. But before this group was founded in around 1919, 1923, the news of Italian futurism reached Poland already in 1909. Professor Ilnytskyi mentioned the Marinetti's manifesto, which was translated in so many languages, and also Marinetti's trip to Russia in 1914. But Marinetti was also translated into Polish, and the first news on Italian futurism reached Poland in May 1909. They were published in a magazine Nowa Reforma. Later on, a full translation of the manifesto of Italian futurism appeared in Świat, in Warsaw magazine, and it was translated by Ignacy Grabowski. And 2 years later, the same manifesto was translated in a magazine Literatura i Sztuka by Cezary Jelenta, who was a famous literary and art critic in Poland. And this what was, I think, very interesting with relation to the translation of this manifesto was that Jelenta connected Marinetti's manifesto to the political situation in Italy, and especially he mentioned Marinetti's call to start the war between Italy and Turkey, and call for the colonization of Libya. So I was very interested also in this response in Poland, and how Italian futurism early on reached Poland before the Polish Futurist group was created. The news about Italian futurist art and painters reached Poland after the famous European tour of futurist paintings started in Paris in February 1912, then London in March 1912, and in Berlin April-May 1912. This tour was reviewed in Polish press, and most notably by the same person, Cezary Jelenta, who reviewed the Berlin show presented in 1912. The same exhibition traveled then to Budapest, but it was supplemented by works of various expressionists, and subsequently it reached Lviv in 1913. But in fact, if we would think that the artworks by Futurists would reach Lviv, it was not, unfortunately, not the case, because the Budapest show was the last stop for the Futurist paintings, and then they came back to Italy and England and Germany to be presented there. So in Lviv in 1913, even if the exhibition was entitled the Exhibition of Futurists, Cubists, etc., it didn't include any work of Italian Futurists. It included only works by Czech, Russian, and German expressionists, which were represented by the Herwart Walden Gallery in Berlin. So this, at the beginning, in Poland, this could have caused some misunderstandings about the terms of Futurism, Cubism. As we see, for example, this poster announced Futurists, but actually it presented only Expressionists. Since we are talking about Ukrainian Futurism, I found in my research a very interesting issue about a magazine, Polish magazine published in Kiev in 1914. And over there, this was a very traditional magazine published only in Polish, edited by Jan Ursyn Zamarayev. And it was devoted most notably to the Polish culture in Ukraine and also the Polish Romanticism. It was very traditional magazine. But even if it was very traditional, over there, Maria Sławinska wrote an article about Italian Futurism in Polish. So in Kiev, the article appeared, and here Maria Sławinska summarized the Futurist concepts and ideas in painting, sculpture, theater, music, and literature. And it was, I think, the first magazine which reproduced so many Futurist artworks next to Polish language. So I also wanted to mention that Maria Sławinska, I couldn't find much information about her. I mean, it was a correspondence she sent to Kiev to publish this article in Głosy Ukraińskie. And I think it's also interesting that so many women arts and literary critics wrote about Futurism in Polish, even if Marinetti was in his manifesto against women, as he outlined, a lot of Polish arts and literary critics wrote actually about Futurism, and in 1914 especially. So this article by Maria Sławinska in Głosy Ukraińskie was one among the many articles which appeared in Polish language about Italian Futurism. And this, what I wanted to also mention, is that in the same magazine, Głosy Ukraińskie, debuted a very important Polish poet, Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz. I mean, Iwaszkiewicz, he cannot be regarded as Polish Futurist, and in fact, he wasn't. But he debuted in Głosy Ukraińskie with his poem on Kiev, poems on Kiev. He was actually born in Kalnik, I think not far away from Kiev. And he was most probably, thanks to the Głosy Ukraińskie, he got acquainted with Italian Futurism. So in 1915, he debuted in Głosy Ukraińskie, and later on in 1916, he went to Warsaw, where he started to collaborate together with Julian Tuwim, who in 1916 wrote that he is the first Polish Futurist, which in fact was not true. And they both also founded the magazine Scamander in 1920. And Iwaszkiewicz also contributed with translation of Italian futurist Giovanni Papini in the magazine Zdrój in Poznań. So even if Iwaszkiewicz sort of distanced himself from Futurism, he was somehow very much interested in this movement. He translated Futurist poetry, and later on he will also be the first reviewer of a Polish Futurist poetry volume. So we are talking now about 1919, and 1919 in Warsaw, when Paszkiewicz was there together with Tuwim, and they co-created Scamander. On the margins, there were two poets, Anatol Stern and Alexander Watt, who created a sort of Futurist group. I mean, the group of two people, maybe it's not a group, but they named themselves Neofuturzy. And this, what I also wanted to show here, is this first leaflet of Polish Futurists called Tak, which actually has been lost for 100 years. And I have discovered it recently in the archive in Dresden. It has been written by Anatol Stern and Alexander Watt. So Warsaw milieu of the Futurists were most notably Anatol Stern and Alexander Watt. And also one poet, Jerzy Jankowski, who actually published only one volume of poetry in 1920, Tram w poprzek ulicy, which can be translated as Tram Across the Street. But he didn't produce more poems because he then was put into the madhouse and could not create more pieces. So when in Warsaw, by the 1919, Anatol Stern and Alexander Watt created the first volumes and leaflets of Polish Futurism, volumes like Futuryzję and the Manifesto, and together with volume Niebieskie Pięty, które trzeba pomalować, the Blue Feet, which needs to be painted. During the same time, the magazine Formiści started to be issued in Kraków. So we have this kind of simultaneously, the Polish Futurism was emerging simultaneously in Warsaw and in Kraków. And Formiści was a magazine devoted to, edited by Tytus Czyżewski, devoted most notably to the formist arts, and the name formists was a kind of a label for Polish artists whose approach to form was different, and they drew on examples of Cubism, Expressionism, and Futurism. And for example, one of the most famous references to Italian Futurism might be this painting by Leon Chwistek entitled Fencing. So Formiści was a group, and they issued a magazine under the same name, where debuted Kraków Futurists, Bruno Jasiński and Stanisław Młodożeniec, together with Tytus Czyżewski. In 1920, they started to publish in these magazines their first poems. So we can talk about Anatol Stern and Alexander Watt in Warsaw, Tytus Czyżewski, Bruno Jasiński, Młodożeniec in Kraków, who joined their forces to create the Polish Futurist group in 1921. And they issued two volumes of manifestos called Jednodniówka Futurystów, like leaflet of the Futurists, and Nóż w brzuchu, a knife in stomach. And here I will also like to refer to Professor Ilnytskyi talk that this what Polish Futurists wanted to do, just like Ukrainian Futurists. They wanted to distance themselves from Marinetti and somehow show that they are creating something totally new. So, for example, in the manifesto of concerning Futurist poetry in 1921, Jasiński wrote, "We do not intend to repeat in 1921 what has already been done in 1908. I mean, he means 1909, the Italian Futurist manifesto. In their case, what in their case was only a premonition, a rapid succession of new perspective, must for us become a concreted, conscious, and creative efforts. It is forbidden in 1921 for anyone to create and construct in a manner that has already been used before. So this was like declared by Ilnytskyi, showing that Polish Futurism, even if the label is the same, they need to distance themselves from Marinetti. But at the end, this was not the case, because when we read the Polish manifestos of Futurists, they kind of copied totally what Marinetti has written in 1909. For example, I'm giving only two examples. Like Marinetti in 1909 wrote, "For far too long has Italy been a marketplace for junk dealers. We want to free our country from the endless number of museums that everywhere cover her like countless graveyards." And Ilnytskyi wrote, "For too long we have been a nation reminiscent of museum of curiosities, producing nothing but mummies and relics." So actually it was a kind of a one-to-one copy of what Marinetti was writing. Also, Marinetti wrote, "A roaring motor car which seems to race on like machine gun fire is more beautiful than the winged victory of Samothrace." And Ilnytskyi wrote, "The telegraphic apparatus of Morse is a masterpiece 1,000 times greater than Byron's Don Juan." So, I mean, this is the same rhetoric, only they are changing the cultural works, like Victory of Samothrace is, for example, here replaced by Byron's Don Juan. So the manifestos which were produced by Polish Futurists, they signaled an attempt at developing a radical program of literary renewal in Poland, but they were kind of getting lost in the jungle of European avant-garde manifestations and were failing to develop a coherent concept of action. So they incorporated many of Marinetti's key concepts in their own theoretical writings. On the other hand, because this collection of Futurist manifestos was published in June 1921, conjoined of Warsaw and Kraków Futurists, the other one, Nóż w brzuchu, knife in stomach, spelled phonetically, announced that Marinetti is foreign to us, so they don't want to have in common anything with Marinetti, and they have written, "Democrats display banners with the words of our Swiss friends, we want to peace in all colors," which kind of directed that Polish Futurists wanted to join actually not the Italian Futurists, but the Swiss Dadaists, and especially Zara, because Zara was the one who wrote that he wanted to peace in all colors. On the other hand, in 1921, in November 1921, when the Knife in Stomach was issued in Warsaw and Kraków, a magazine Nowa Sztuka appeared in Warsaw, and over there, which was edited actually by Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, whom I mentioned in the beginning, and Anatol Stern, the futurist, where Polish futurist Anatol Stern wrote his sort of poem manifesto called Jumping Reflectors of the World, and wrote, "Come to me, my friends, and you, Cocteau, and you, Majakowski, Boccioni, Carra, Arp, Zara, and you and they, futurists, Dadaists, there is no difference. All, we need to strangle the citizen today." So what here Anatol Stern wanted to say is that actually there is no difference between Italian futurists and Dadaists like Arp and Zara, because they all need to create a sort of international of artists who need to strangle the citizen. This is the main aim of their activity. So the Polish futurism was really short-lived. I mean, actually, when we think about their activity, it is said it's between 1919 and 1923, but actually only the year 1921 was their joint activity as a group of 5 poets. Then many of them started to collaborate with other magazines, and for example with Zwrotnica, where which was edited by Tadeusz Piper, who came back to Poland from Spain through France and wanted to create a new avant-garde movement in Poland. He founded this magazine Zwrotnica in Kraków, where Polish Futurists started also to publish their poems. And in the last issue of 1923, the number 5, Bruno Jasiński wrote that the Polish Futurism died. So the Polish Futurism was no longer existent. And actually, when we look at the cover of this magazine, we see the new direction of the Polish avant-garde, which was most notably the constructivist approach, because Zwrotnica was a sort of magazine, a transition magazine between Polish futurism and Polish constructivism. To the same number of Zwrotnica, Marinetti sent his letter praising Zwrotnica and Polish avant-garde, claiming that they are futurists, but actually on the next pages of the same number of the magazine, Piper started to really criticize Italian futurism and wrote that actually everything what Futurists did is misunderstanding the concepts of dynamisms, and he announced that a lot of errors appeared in Italian futurists thought about the new concept of art. So actually the only person who was like from Polish avant-garde movement, which was very much close to Marinetti, was a poet who was not a futurist and who was connected to Tadeusz Piper, and his name was Jalo Kurek. He was a very important translator of Italian futurists and also published in Zwrotnica and was a member of the so-called Kraków avant-garde. His poems, he went also to Naples, he met Marinetti there in 1924, he met Ruggero Vasari, he met Enrico Prampolini, he was in contact with Paolo Buzzi. So he was like a major point after Polish futurism, a major contact to Italian futurists. So in 1924, like 1 year after Polish futurism was announced to be dead by Jasiński, Marinetti issued a very famous manifesto called Futurism Mondial, where he wrote that the Polish futurists were Tuwim, Żarnower, Strzemiński, Słonimski, Wierzyński, Piper, Kurek, Stern, Watt, Witkiewicz, Jasiński, Czyżewski, Kołtoński. But actually, he just like mentioned various people because like Kołtoński was a journalist, Żarnower was a constructivist, Tuwim was a Scamander poet, much more traditional, Słonimski, Wierzyński as well. So he was also sort of lost what actually Polish futurism was. And at the end, just wanted to briefly mention the Marinetti's trip to Poland, because I cannot talk, unfortunately, more about this issue, because Marinetti came to Poland in 1933 to Warsaw, Lviv, and to Kraków. And this, what I find very interesting is that he didn't meet with any former Polish futurists. I mean, some of them were already living abroad, like Jasiński was living in Soviet Union by that time, but he didn't meet with either with Czyżewski, either with Stern or Watt or any others, but was kind of invited by the Polish politicians, like nationalist politicians, because for them, Marinetti was a kind of a figure very close connected to Mussolini. And actually the journey of Marinetti to Poland was much more political journey for Marinetti to meet with Polish politicians and right-wing writers, rather than to connect him with the ex-Polish futurists. So I think this might be I would love to talk more about like some relationships between Italian Futurism and Poland, especially. But I think I already talked too much, so I give Igor the voice right now.
Thank you very much. And right away, I want to ask a question that comes from myself and from the audience as well. Can you please tell us why Polish Futurism was ended so abruptly? Can you please tell us the motivation of Ilnytskyi, of Stern, why they stopped? Maybe that was their personal exhaustion, or maybe that was evolution to other platforms. Can you please tell us what exactly, specifically that was?
Yes, thank you very much for the question and the great translation of the question. Yes, like Jasiński wrote in the magazine Zwrotnica a brief history about Polish Futurism and announced that Polish Futurism is dead. And he no longer, that the Polish Futurism no longer exists. It was Zwrotnica number 6 of 1923 was published in October. So it was by the end of 1923. And it was true because when we think about the next activity, especially of Jasiński and Stern, they started to work together and turned to the left. I think it's a good way of saying that and expressing that, because they published a book called Ziemia na lewo, the Earth towards the left, where they sort of started to be very much committed to the leftist and proletarian culture. They started to collaborate with the magazine called Nowa Kultura, the New Culture, where they started to very much be involved socially. And like Polish Futurism was much more like cabarets. Like they didn't really, like Polish Futurists didn't really take in this, their Futurist works seriously. This shift is very much more visible in 1924, when they started to really collaborate, to be really like socially engaged, and they published the book, the volume, poetry volume, The Earth on the Left, and showing their commitment also to Polish Communist Party. I don't remember, and I don't want to be wrong right now, but I think that if they not joined the Polish Communist Party, I don't remember if they joined, they were very closely related to it. And Futurism was sort of a cabaret-like preparation for the kind of major commitment to socially engaged literature. And the Ziemia na lewo, the volume which I mentioned, was designed by Mieczysław Szczuka in a photomontage manner. And it was the first photomontage in Poland. And Szczuka was a leader of constructivist movement in Poland and constructivist group. And also he was a member of the Polish Communist Party. In 1925, Jasiński needed to flee to Paris. I mean, he went to Paris and he was then connected to the French Communist Party. So the Polish Futurism was sort of the first step. Like we are against everything. We are against everyone. We are against Italian Futurism and so on. But the constructive period started right after 1923. Like 1924 was much more devoted to kind of building the new proletarian culture according to what was going on in Soviet Russia, because Soviet Russia was a sort of model, especially for Jasiński. For Stern was a little bit different later on, because he was in the 1930s writing books which praised Piłsudski. So here, maybe it's a very interesting comparison to what Professor Ilnytskyi was talking about, national versions of Ukrainian Futurism. So I think this announcement of Jasiński that Polish Futurism died in 1923 as a group, maybe not as aesthetics, because the aesthetics, some of the poets or artists, maybe they were still influenced by the group, for sure didn't produce anything later on after 1923 as a group, 5 poets. I mean, Anatol Stern and Jasiński, they still collaborated, but not as the group which issued the volumes of manifestos.
Thank you so much, Przemek. And right away, there is another question from our audience. Are the ideas of futurism popular right now in Poland?
This is a good question about, I mean, we are living now in a futurist times. So, I mean, for example, the futurists, Polish futurists were really kind of anarchic. We can say they were kind of anarchists, and they, for example, wrote in the manifesto, in the volume Nóż w brzuchu, Knife in the Stomach, that Bóg, honor, ojczyzna, like God, Father, God, honor, and fatherland are the worst words ever to be used, that they denounced these words. So this might maybe relate to what is going on in the underground movements in Poland, on the one hand. But on the other hand, they also wrote that the red flag is like a tissue to, you know, to clean your nose. So on the one hand, they denounced God's honor, fatherland, so the 3 major nationalistic symbols for Poland. And on the other hand, they ridiculed the communists, saying that like the red flag is a tissue for the nose. So, I mean, what is going on in Poland? It's sometimes stories repeats themselves, sometimes not. It's hard to really talk about it that way, but like this idea of a kind of movement which is against national symbols sometimes can, for example, maybe relate to what is going on in the anti-government protests in Poland right now, I think. Because also like Polish futurists, they were very much anti-clerical. So this also can maybe connect them to what is going on with the young movements in Poland who are, you know, rebelling against the government.
Thank you, Mr. Strączek. And before giving the floor to Andriy Boyarov, I would like to come back to some questions from the audience that are addressed to Mr. Ilnytskyi. Let's go with the first one. In your opinion, what impact had the Futurism period on the course of nowadays art, and why is it important to realize it today? Mr. Ilnytskyi, it seems your mic is off again.
Sorry. Well, I think it is quite an interesting question. I believe that the most significant impact of Ukrainian Futurism is formalistic. Idealistic moments that were dominant during that time are long gone, but the form and the accent on the experimental part, ability to be open to the new art forms in general, this is probably the biggest influence Ukrainian Futurism had on nowadays. I think we can see it in early 90s in Ukraine when Bubabu and other examples of young and fresh Ukrainian poetry appears. It is not accidental that they come back to Ukrainian Futurism, they take over these formalistic literature experiments and based on those they go even further. Mr. Ilnytskyi, another question to you from the audience. What do you think helped Ukrainian futurism to become unique and original? I believe it's Ukraine itself, the society of that time. Mr. Ilnytskyi, another question to you from the audience. What do you think helped Ukrainian futurism to become unique and original? Well, I believe it's Ukraine itself, the society of that time. I also want to underline the fact that even though Ukrainian futurism was very open to the world in general and to the West culture in particular, it still was based on what was happening in Ukraine at that time. Cemencore, for instance, was very conscious about his surroundings and culture. And these surroundings affected a lot the process of development of Ukrainian futurism. It is rather obvious in political aspect, for example. Policies of Soviet Union and Communist Party influenced it a lot. Let's take a look on the debate between Futurists and Mykola Khvylevy or literature organization Avant-Garde. So the surroundings played a huge part and formed and changed Ukrainian futurism. Thank you, Mr. Ilnytskyi, and we also have received 2 questions to Mr. Strączek, both of them, of course, concern Polish movement. And the first one is, what Polish futuristic painters do you consider to be the most interesting?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Of course, when we talk about the Polish Futurist group, it was a literary group. This we need to always remember. But I also mentioned in my presentation the group of formists who were, it was a very experimental, by that time, group, which borrowed some influences from Expressionism, Cubism, and Futurism. Because Cubism, Expressionism, and Futurism changed the approach towards form, the formists called themselves the formists because of the same idea of this new approach toward form. That's why it was a kind of eclectic movement which combined Cubism, Expressionism, and Futurism into one. So when it comes to the visual artists, I think Leon Chwistek was among the most futurist-linked artists because he explored the issues of dynamism in his paintings, but also he explored the issues of the modern contemporary city life. For example, in his famous painting, the Miasto Fabryczne, the industrial city. So also the idea of modernity and the simultaneity in his paintings are very close to what Umberto Boccioni and other Italian futurists claimed to explore. So I think the formist, Leon Chwistek, was the most close to, as an artist, Italian futurists. It's also important to mention that he lived in Lviv in 1930s. Whose artists could also be sort of related to, I mean, Tytus Czyżewski, he was the only Polish futurist who was not only a poet, but also a visual artist. I mean, he was also a painter, but I wouldn't maybe his early multiplanar pictures, which were sort of combination of 3-dimensional sculptures and paintings, they resembled somehow what was doing Giacomo Balla, the Italian futurists, in the famous series of Complessi Plastici, the plastic complexes. So here Czyżewski and Balla, they were somehow similar as well as Giacomo Balla and Chwistek and maybe a little bit Boccioni. I know that right now there is at the National Museum in Warsaw, there will be an exhibition devoted to Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, who was a very important Polish avant-garde artist, not connected to any of the movement. And if someone would connect him, maybe he was much more connected to surrealism. But he also exhibited with the formists And I know that one of the chapters of this exhibition will be devoted to his links with Umberto Boccioni, with Italian Futurists. So there was a sort of like futurist aesthetics when it comes to exploration of dynamism, the modern city life, the simultaneity, and the absolute movement in the painting. Those issues were taken up by Polish visual artists. And I think Chwistek, Czyżewski, they were the the closest one. Maybe also Jan Hrynkowski, who painted a painting called Ja winda, Me Elevator, where his body was kind of merging the elevator. And it was also in line with the concept of Umberto Boccioni, who wrote about the absolute movement, that human beings and objects, they are kind of melting together with relation also to the Bergsonian philosophy. So, I mean, there are some Polish futurist-linked painters, but
I am not a specialist in film. And from what I remember and read of Ukrainian Futurism, although they were very interested in film and contributed mightily to the development of Ukrainian film industry, I cannot recall a single instance of them quoting Italian futurists in film. In fact, it's an interesting point that I don't think they ever translated the Italian futurist manifestos into Ukrainian. They may have appeared later, but I don't think not in the 1920s. So no, I don't recall them citing. In the early 1920s, like 1921, 1922, they make reference to the Italians, but not in terms of the film industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Strączek. Just a second, I will check for some more questions. For now, it seems that no new questions have appeared. So I am giving the floor to Andriy Boyarov, and we will be delighted to hear his opinion on Ukrainian futurism and on avant-garde in general in the context of the political process. To my mind, it is pointless to discuss art omitting its existence in the particular historical and political setting, and Andriy has his point of view particularly connected to the state formation, avant-garde and the process of creation of Ukrainian state. That would be the name of your report. Andriy, please. Thank you and Victoria for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this panel, and I separately thank a lot to Mr. Ilnytskyi and Mr. Strączek, not only for being here today, but my interest, to be honest, in this topic is very much inspired by their works, publications, and our meetings. Unlike them, I am not historian of arts or literature, I am an artist myself. But during the last years, I have also worked as an art supervisor, and both Mr. Ilnytskyi and Mr. Strączek have a huge influence on me. Also, it would be much easier for me to talk after their presentations. Since some topics have already been mentioned, I will try to explore those a bit deeper and from other perspectives. So, I am joining you today from Lviv. And during the historical period in between two world wars, Lviv was at the intersection of Polish and Ukrainian modernism. Or even, I should say, avant-garde. It was in between the mutual impact of these two movements, so I would call it an ideal balance. On one hand, we can say that Lviv is a city of avant-garde or futurism, but at the same time, events that took place here were so climatic that no other part of the region can compete. I don't know any other city where the already mentioned by Mr. Strączek exhibition could take place in 1913. Starting from 1920s, Pawlo Kovzun has been a resident of the city. Bruno Jasensky, that Przemysław has already mentioned as well, also was active here. Leo Chwistek appeared after 1930s, and the list goes on. And of course, we can't forget the visit of Marinetti himself. All these events are very important, but as I already stated, they are at the intersection of Polish and Ukrainian movements, or I would even say in our mutual field. But also the previous question I find interesting, the first question addressed to Przemek about the short existence of Polish Futurism. It subtly introduces the topic that I want to touch, how this social commitment continued Ukrainian Futurism since the political situation in Poland was quite different than in Ukraine. Artists in Poland could realize their social engagement both on social and governmental level through their art. It spread not only the Futurism, but the artists from other branches also borrowed some ideas and strategies from Avant-Garde and Futurism, and this, in my opinion, is the most important difference of Poland and Ukraine of that time period. That's why I wanted to state that maybe the facts and thoughts are similar in my research, Mr. Ilnytskyi research, and Mr. Strączek, but I approach those from a slightly other perspective. As we know, the beginning of avant-garde movement started in 1910 and evolved through 20s and 30s of 20th century. It was non-governmental issue consciously. In 1930s, however, everyone concentrated on their separate countries and problems of those countries. The biggest Ukrainian problem at that time probably was that independence lasted too short here. But while these art movements were created in 1920s and 1930s, different concepts of governmental state appeared, starting from nationalistic ideas to the proletarian government state, even to the extent of anarchism ideas. Mikhailo Cemencore, to my mind, is more a performer and activist than a writer. I call him the front man of Futurism. Probably he combined all of those elements in himself. He was anarchist in the beginning, then nationalist, and also proletarian later. As we know, the first group appeared with his brother Vasil and Pawlo Kovzun in 1913. This group he calls Quero. First, their manifest was published in 1914. We need to remind ourselves that they were using Latin alphabet in their texts. Because of that, they wanted to spread more widely in the world, but at the same time, it was their offer to the government. Later, in 1926, there was a suggestion to implement Latin alphabet in the governmental levels. As you remember, only thanks to a small quantity of votes that was missing to create a majority, in Kharkiv this idea didn't reach its goal. This was one of the first and the most fundamental influences of Futurists in general and Cemencore in particular. And as Mr. Ilnytskyi has already stated, Ukrainian Futurists separated themselves constantly from Italian and Soviet Futurists. At the same time, Cemencore stated that art cannot belong to Ukraine or to any other nation. If it does belong to any nation, it shows how primitive it is. But at the same time, as we know, he practiced and he contributed only to the Ukrainian culture and arts. But to quote Cemencore one more time, he stated, "Let the previous generation of our parents, who didn't give us anything at all, enjoy and indulge our national art and go to grave hand in hand with it. We, the youth, will not give them a hand of help. We are chasing modern day." This also was the reason why Cemencore separated from Ukrainian modernists. His biggest achievement is considered to be that he threw Shevchenko from his pedestal, and he already did that in his first collection of poems called Daring. I cannot glorify Shevchenko when I see that he is under my feet. I am burning the Kobzar book. His activity was noticed not only in publishing, but he also contributed to the visual aspects of arts during that time. Already in his first collection of publishing, he uses a visual, poetical approach. As for me, it is as if he's using posters for his poems. As for me, this poetically visual approach is similar to concept of Gerald Taigie and the group Nine Forces. They had so-called Manifest of Poetics, and about that, Karl Sirp can probably tell about that better in his texts. First and foremost, they also were working on the text experiments in their group. Another famous piece of futuristic art was the manifest of Bruno Jasemski about political spelling. And Polish manifest also uses that political spelling. And also I wanted to state that these similarities that we can observe in between Polish and Ukrainian movements probably come at the beginning from the roots of Italian futurism. Queer futurists at the stage of anarchy had a huge plan of activities ahead of them. Futuristic drama, futuristic music, futuristic visual approaches, and the philosophy of queer futurism, but unfortunately the First World War stopped all of those anarchist endeavors. Everyone was enlisted in the army, and as we know, Vasil Cemencore died in this World War. Mikhail was serving in Far East, and Pavlo Kovzhin was serving in Carpathians, which later became the reason why he lived in Lviv. But this time was a turning point in Ukrainian modernism and led to the next phase. As Cemencore stated later in magazine Semaphore of the Future, we have chased the day of today. He believed they caught up themselves with modern time. After war, Cemencore came back to his village in Poltava region. That was at the end of 1917. At the same time, on 7th November, in Kiev, the Ukrainian People's Republic was declared. Already on 22nd December happened the inauguration of Ukrainian Academy of Arts, together with the opening of exhibitions of its professors. It is hard to call the professors of this academy futuristic or avant-garde artists, but the strategies they use resemble the avant-garde ones. Among those professors were Anatoly Boychuk, Vasil Krychevsky, Fedor Krychevsky, Mikhailo Zhuk, Alexander Morashko, Georgy Narbut, Bram Manevich. This engagement in social governmental issues and events gives them the status of an avant-garde artists, since we see how much engaged they were. The creation of the Academy of Arts itself was connected with the competition for independence and was very important in that time. The committee that created this academy was supported by Central Council of Ukraine, the main governmental body of that time. And the future president of that time, Mikhailo Grushevsky, was supervising it all the way. Both his wife and his brother were in the operating group. The compound and regulations of the academy were declared by Central Council of Ukraine. Let's remind ourselves that academy was located in the same building as the Central Council, which I found very symbolic. Academy was composed out of 5 branches: painting, sculpture, architecture, graphics, and artistic craft. Already in 1918, Krychevsky designed small and big coat of arms, small and big governmental stamp, vignette of documents, and governmental credit papers. All in all, 20 artists were engaged in so-called governmental expedition of Ukrainian documents. Those were Boychuk, his wife, Alexander Bogomazov, Narbut, brothers Krychevsky. All of them created a new identity of the Ukrainian state at that time. But they didn't just stop on the visual part, they dig deeper to create the whole style, ruling, and communication with people of Ukrainian state. So aesthetic questions gradually turned into ethical questions. This work covered all the branches of socially and governmental structures. starting from state symbols, proceeding with design of uniforms, trademarks, new fonts of the books and publishings, design of playing cards, and even kids' toys. Narbut probably started all of this earlier than everyone else. He started in 1917 when he came to St. Petersburg after Munich. He started designing new Ukrainian fonts and alphabet together with ABC books. And later, at the opening of the Academy exhibition, his fonts were a sensation. All this enthusiastic story doesn't last long, since in 1920s it is the last time when Ukrainian army with its Polish departments comes to Kiev for the last time. And later, next 2 years, Academy acts independently. In 1922, National Guard gradually turns into Art Institute. But we need to state that at this time, Morashko was already killed, Narbut was poisoned, Manevich moved to Warsaw and later to New York. But at the same time, in 1922 appears the new group of professors of avant-garde such as Vadim Meller, Bogomazov, and at the end of 1920s, Tatler and Malevich. Cemencore, whom we left aside for a bit, comes back to Kiev in 1918 at the same time of Hetman Skoropadsky's rule. He holds himself in opposition of the artistic society of the capital city. He has his openly declared position against modernists who stay at the key governmental positions. But in 1919, he organizes the new group called Flamingo and starts to cooperate with Georgy Narbut. When Cemencore becomes the director of magazine art, Narbut is the one who designs covers and visual design. In 1926, Cemencore works with Vasil Krichevsky on the shooting of the movie Shevchenko, even though we remember his attitude towards Shevchenko. Magazine art, for a certain amount of time, continues the policy of Ukrainization, but probably at that time when Futurism just ended in Poland, the most productive period starts in Ukraine when Pan-Futurism appears. Pan-Futurism is the branch of Futurism, the main goal of which was to unite all the other branches. And here I will quote Cemencore. I see Futurism as a form of destruction of everything that it sees on its way before the previous art as we know it ceases to exist. Here, Futurists hold their grounds to try to realize their dreams in the state that is going to the future. And during that time, during second half of 1920s, Cemencore organizes the publishings of his magazine New Generation. He immerses himself fully in the building of new Soviet Ukraine. They discuss new possibilities and social projects, new forms in cinema, theater, and photography, and also they possess wide international connections. Although it lasted shortly from 1927 to 1930, I believe the input of the development of avant-garde is underestimated. We cannot forget Cemencore's friend Pavlo Kovzhun, who started living in Lviv, and there he played principal role in that surrounding. It is hard to call him avant-garde artist, but he had a trait that, to my mind, is typical for all futurists in general. He was hyperactive, just like Marinetti and Cemencore and Bruno Yashensky. The amount of things he managed to achieve in Lviv is unbelievable, one of which was creating a Ukrainian organization, ANUM, the main goal of which was to see Ukrainian artists all together as a whole. Doesn't matter where they come from, Soviet Ukraine, Western Ukraine, Poland, Paris, Berlin. He and his colleagues perceived Ukraine as one country and saw a powerful, wholesome, together united government. And of course, as we know, the end of New Generation was the fall of Ukrainian avant-garde movement and physical end of all the participants who didn't have time to move from Lviv, or even those who moved For instance, brothers Kryszyński died in Kharkiv instead. So in that, I see a huge difference between Ukraine and Poland in horrible repressions that cut it all down right at the very dawn of 1930s. In short, that's what I wanted to describe, the vision of those artists at that time. Thank you, Andriy, and right away we have a question for you from the audience. Can you please tell if any of the political forces used futurists in their manipulations? Were futurists apolitical or involved into some political forces? There's no way that there is no connection with politics. There is a whole separate article about visit of Marinetti to Lviv, how it was perceived then, and he was a part of fascist government after all. The majority of Polish futurists ignored his arrival or criticized it. Let's remember that Ukrainian newspapers criticized his ideas and found them not appropriate. Of course, Soviet Ukraine used the futurists, but I believe it was a mutual process, since futurists also found their way to realize themselves. If we talk about Leon Chwistik, who switched to the Marxist views in 1930s, and it was a complicated situation at that time, the conflict between Ukrainian and Polish right movements, there was ghetto and killings. Chwistik was against, but he alone could not make a huge difference. Andriy, one more question. How Ukraine would look like today according to futuristic visions? I would remember here not futurists themselves, but the heritage of Ukrainian National Republic, which to my mind was too short. I think this project was so interesting, just the fact that on the money bills of that time we can see Polish, Yiddish, Ukrainian, Russian languages, and that already says a lot to us. It's not just the visual aspect, it has a social subtext. That bill shows the idea of a state. Even the academy was a phenomenon as well. I wouldn't call it Kiev Bauhaus, but ideas were similar. Social influence was huge as well. And I'm deeply sorry that we didn't continue that culture. One more question, Andriy, to you as an artist. What is more important, construction or destruction? I believe they are mutually connected. One goes before the other. First, you need to have construction to destroy. Cemencore is an important part of it all, and I believe there is not enough of avant-garde influence on Ukraine. For instance, we can't call Malevich ours, since there was simply not enough time to adopt his ideas. What to do with it? I have no idea. Thank you, Andriy. Unfortunately, the time of our discussion runs out. I wanted to state that the amount of our participants today should have been bigger, but unfortunately, in the last minute, due to different reasons, some of them had to pass. We were expecting Myroslava Mudrak, a professor of University of Ohio and author of the book New Generation and Art of Modernism. Also, Oleh Koshuba, Volvach, candidate of art history and explorer of Alexander Bogomazov biography, Karl Sipra, explorer of arts from Prague, and Vera Faber unfortunately won't take part tomorrow. She got sick and we wish her to get well soon. But texts of these scientists and publishers will be published in our catalog that is going out soon. I also wanted to announce that we meet here tomorrow at 5 p.m. by Kiev time. Our participants will be Hanna Veselovska, PhD in History of Arts, professor of Ukrainian Art Institute, author of the book Ukrainian Theater Avant-Garde, Petr Rybson, professor of Polish-Japanese Academy of Computer Science, supervisor of Jewish Institute of History, and Yarina Tsembal, candidate of Literature Sciences and historian, author of the project Our 20th Movement. And we will talk tomorrow about separate aspects and names of Ukrainian Futurism. Thank you again very much for your attention, and I remind you that our project is sponsored by Ukrainian Cultural Fund, and our exhibition runs until 29th of January of 2022. Thanks again, and see you tomorrow at 5 a.m. by Kyiv time.